ask anyone how memory works, they describe a hard drive. We assume our brains record events, file them away in a specific folder, and pull them up cleanly when we need them. The biological reality is distinct. Recall looks more like a shattered glass rapidly reassembling itself from scattered fragments in real time. For decades, psychology operated on the video camera metaphor. It fed the concept of repressed memories, the belief that trauma or obscure facts were locked away in a pristine, untouchable vault deep in the brain, waiting for the right trigger to hit play. That model was dismantled by cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. Through her research into eyewitness testimony, Loftus demonstrated that human memory is highly malleable, displacing the idea of the brain as an objective recording device. Loftus proved a biological axiom: a memory is never retrieved, it is rebuilt. When you think of a past event or a piece of data, your brain pulls distinct neurological fragments, sights, sounds, emotions, from separate regions of the cortex and stitches them together on the fly. Because the memory is being actively manufactured, it is inherently fluid. The paradox of recall is that the simple act of remembering something physically alters the memory. You are layering your current state of mind, current context, and new information over the old pathways. This shift from storage to reconstruction suggests that our standard learning systems may be built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the brain. To retain information, we have to look past storage and master the process of reconstruction itself. To understand how to engineer that reconstruction process, we look to the clinical bedrock of modern memory science. In 1953, a man named Henry Mollison, known to history as patient HM, suffered from debilitating seizures. In a desperate surgical procedure to cure his epilepsy, doctors opened HM's skull and removed a specific seahorse-shaped structure, the hippocampus. The seizures stopped, but the procedure triggered a catastrophic side effect. HM lost the ability to form any new long-term memories. He could hold a conversation for exactly as long as his immediate attention lasted, but the moment he was distracted, the timeline wiped clean. Then, researchers introduced an anomaly. They asked HM to trace a complex star on a piece of paper, but he could only see his hand through a mirror. It is a difficult motor task. On day 1, he failed repeatedly, but by day 3, he drew the star perfectly. He was acquiring a technical skill. Yet every single time the researcher handed him the pencil, HM believed it was his very first time attempting the task. He had no conscious memory of ever practicing it. HM's condition proved that memory is not a singular bucket. It is a series of isolated biological networks. One network can be destroyed, while another continues to learn, adapt, and process data in isolation. This wireframe brain models the architecture of HM's retained abilities. By mapping his surgical deficits against his surviving skills, neurologists isolated 3 distinct memory systems. The first is working memory, operating in the prefrontal cortex. This is your immediate processor. It is a fragile, limited network that handles active problem solving. It drops data the moment attention shifts. The second is long-term declarative memory. This network houses explicit facts, concepts, and personal events. This relies on the hippocampus, the structure removed from HM. When it was severed, his declarative network faded to black. The third is procedural memory. This network governs motor skills, subconscious habits, and pattern recognition. It is housed in the basal ganglia. Because the structure remained intact, HM could master the mirror drawing without his declarative network ever knowing it happened. Building an effective learning protocol means engineering the explicit transfer of data from your fragile working memory into durable declarative networks. To do that, you have to eliminate passive processing. The primary obstacle to this data transfer is a specific cognitive trap identified by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, the fluency illusion. The human brain relies on mental shortcuts. Kahneman showed that we misinterpret the ease with which we process information, its fluency, as the actual mastery of that information. This scatterplot visualizes the fluency illusion in action. When you highlight a textbook or reread your notes, the visual task feels easy. The text is familiar, so the brain registers high fluency. But the data shows a stark inverse correlation. The easier the material feels to review, the worse it performs under actual testing conditions. Cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork defined the countermeasure to this as desirable difficulties. As the graph shifts to show, Neurological strength requires cognitive friction. If there is no struggle to retrieve the answer, there is no signal sent to the brain to fortify the neural pathway. Building intellectual systems requires recognizing these cognitive traps and shifting from passive observation to active engineering. If you want to master the daily frameworks that drive actual, measurable growth, subscribe to Growth Systems Daily. The data is clear. If a learning technique feels effortless and fluid in the moment, you are guaranteed to forget it. To map how quickly that forgetting happens, we look to Ebbinghaus, who pioneered the first raw quantitative data on memory loss in the late 19th century. This graph models the classic Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It tracks the biological decay rate of unreinforced information. Within 24 hours of learning something new, your working memory will dump up to 70% of the data if no intervention occurs. Spaced repetition algorithms, like those used in the software Anki, interrupt this decay. By placing vertical markers at the moment the brain is about to lose the data, the software forces a recall event, flattening the curve and resetting the decay clock. But timing is only half the equation. The action you take during that interval dictates the retention. In 2006, researchers Roediger and Karpicke published a paper in the journal Science, proving what actually fortifies the declarative network. These bar charts compare 1-week retention data. Group A, labeled Study, repeatedly reviewed the source material. Group B, labeled Study Test, read the material once and then were forced to test themselves. The Study Test group outperformed the reviewers. This is active recall, forcing the brain to generate an answer out of thin air without looking at the source, causes physical neuroplastic adaptation. This adaptation is governed by the encoding specificity principle. Memory is context-dependent. The pathways you build are strongest when the environment of your practice matches the environment of your performance. Durable retention is constructed through the deliberate friction of forced retrieval. It is built through active engagement, not the passive accumulation of exposure. We can synthesize the clinical data of patient HM, Bjork's desirable difficulties, and the Roediger retrieval research into an executable daily architecture. This 4-quadrant grid outlines the specific protocol. Quadrant 1 is review timing. You must intercept biological decay. Map out specific spaced repetition intervals for your material. Force the first review at 1 hour, the next at 1 day, then 3 days, and then 1 week. Quadrant 2 dictates your retrieval sessions. Eliminate passive reading. Closed book, active recall testing is the only acceptable metric of study. If you cannot produce the answer from a blank page, you do not know it. Quadrant 3 is the progressive overload of recall. Treat cognitive friction like physical weightlifting. As a concept becomes fluent, you must escalate the complexity of your self-testing to maintain desirable difficulty. Introduce elaborative interrogation into this step. Do not just test yourself on the what. Force your brain to explain the why. Connecting new facts to underlying principles forces the declarative network to dig deeper, more resilient pathways. Quadrant 4 is interleaved processing. Do not study one domain in an isolated block. Mix your subjects and variables daily. This prevents the brain from relying on predictable patterns and forces it to constantly reevaluate context. If you are ready to stop passively consuming information and start building the internal frameworks that generate real output, subscribe to Growth Systems Daily. We break down the exact protocols you need to scale your capabilities. The science reveals that recall functions as a muscular reconstruction engine. It requires intentional breaking down and engineering to reach its full capacity.